laptop. Okay. And we're going to go over all of the materials. Okay. So talk a little bit about this. Okay. All righty. So again, guys, you will not be recorded, FYI. The only thing that's being recorded is this video here. This will be uploaded later today under the modules tab under video demonstrations. Okay. And I do apologize. I think these are the shadows of these containers here. So I'll move them out of the way. Oh, let me get just back in here. Alrighty. So let's talk a little bit about materials. Now, I have a lot. There's a lot of palettes available. A lot. There are some that are large, okay? Some that are flat, like this. Some that are angled, like this. There are many different types of palette knives. Some that are smaller, like that. Some that are taller and skinnier, like that. They all really vary. You can really use any of them, okay? But a part of this assignment is really finding what's going to work best. The one that's available, I think it was a size 4, if I'm not mistaken, under the supply list, is a great one to use. And that should be this one. Okay. Again, put these on the side. Don't need to use any more. Okay. So I have my palette knife. I also do have my best friend, my blue painter's tape. This is a great resource, again, to make your actual grid rather than actually using a ruler. So you can actually take a large piece of tape as a guide and tape it onto corner to corner and make a diagonal line here. Now, you don't necessarily have to make a diagonal line with graphite. I just used a number 6 pencil to make the grid. Again, guys, if you guys can see, you can kind of see where that is. But also, what's really important is that you need to get your Studio Blick traditional profile canvases. This is the 18 by 24. These are, you know, really inexpensive. They're really actually not as thick and not as thin, but on the back, this is something to sort of think about when your painting is really, you know, it's falling apart in terms of looseness, like if it's starting to bend and curve on the surface. One thing to test is if you lift it off the surface to tap, you could hear almost like a drum, like it's really tight. And if you ever need to retighten this, take a paper towel and just add some water and just really massage it into the back of the fibers, okay? Where it's not primed. Then when you flip it back, you can hear almost like a drum. That's a real indicator of sort of finding if the canvas itself is really tight and stretched properly, okay? So that's another thing to sort of keep in mind. If, let's say, for example, if you're painting, you apply a lot of pressure, notice how it bends into the surface. And if it starts to stay that way, I would flip it on its back, add a little bit of water, just massage some of that area, wait for it to dry, probably like a minute, and then you should be good to go. It then tightens all those fibers of the canvas back to normal. Any questions about that? Okay.
Do you have to let it dry?
Yes.
After you put the water? Oh, I don't know. Thank you.
No, you're good, Jessica. Yeah. Guys, feel free to ask any questions. And if I go too fast, please let me know. I have my canvas pads here. You can start to see, depending on the light source. This is natural light, by the way. Some of this is bending. Okay. Now I can take a piece out of the pads. Now this, you know, you actually use this almost like a sketch paper. Move my canvas. And then actually on the actual surface, for it not to keep bowing and bending, I can take some tape. And this is when you want to follow along, you can then just tape it with your blue painter's tape or your beige standard tape. Doesn't really matter as long as it's painter's tape. you could then have a nice surface to work from as a preliminary drawing or a preliminary painting.
So we'll do this for a color wheel.
Correct.
Okay.
This is what you can do without moving it around. So it doesn't move on each surface. So then you could really have fun and apply a lot of pressure. You could be really aggressive while you're painting. And ideally, your color wheel should look like this. Okay. Let me zoom in slightly so you can see.
Do we sketch out the outline with graphite?
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
okay.
Actually going to talk about that right now. So again, this is about 10 inches in diameter. You could use a ruler. You could also use like a bowl or a plate or dinner plate just to make an outline. This measurement here for these angles of this triangle is about 5 inches. So 5, 5, 5. And that reference on the lecture should be a good image to use when you're looking at those actual direct colors. Now, again, some of you may vary from the colors that you have. Different brands make different colors, but it should be the same. This is one that was blended. This was one that was not. Again, I'm not interested in the correct measurements. That's not important. I want to see how well you were able to develop a yellow green, how well you were able to develop an orange red, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is a vital aspect of the assignment. You will then upload this image without your achromatic grayscale, with your reference, and then your painting by the end of next week. This is an example of the value scales that we talked a little bit about. You don't necessarily have to do these shades. These are about 9 shades, but just for the sake of the demo, I wanted you guys to show you. So if you want to look at that as more as a reference, you can do that under the actual lecture, okay? Now let's talk a little bit about palettes. So I have my paper palette here, okay? Paper palette's really great to use. This is one of the references we use from previous quarters. We'll talk a little bit about portraiture when we get into the last assignment. But this is actually a really great palette. And then one of the reasons why is that, again, when you're making your colors on here, you could take it off on the pack. Okay, you could also, more plasticky, glossy surface. I like to keep it right next to, like probably on the side on my canvas pad, so I can have it like right here. I can also tape it to the actual counter on the surface. This is, again, once you're done, fold it, you can throw it away. Bing, bada, boom. Now, those of you who have a glass palette and were interested in working with a glass palette, again, that was optional, so you don't necessarily have to get it. Let me just move some of this. Give me 1 second. Okay, it looks like this. Okay, now the glass palette, which can come out. Now the one here that can come out, actually a gray sheet of paper on the back so I can see my colors much more clearly, and just added some blue painter's tape. I've had this for a few years, so it's seen some rough days, but it's really helpful to use. So if I ever take my palette knife, it's really easy to mix and blend my colors. I'll actually use that for the demo itself, just for the sake of the demo. But if you want me to use the plastic palettes, just let me know. And in terms of colors, again, I have my variety of my colors here. I'm just going to put that on the side. But before anything else, I have my reference. So I'm going to do a mirrored reference on my end. Give me 1 second. Where's my reference? Where'd it go? Okay.
Sorry, can I ask a quick question? This is Megan speaking.
Go ahead, Megan.
Yeah, so just a quick question about the color wheel. I had already started working on that, and then I noticed that making the purple with the red and the blue was not working well for me. Are you going to be showing some mixing of those colors?
Yes, but
Okay.
we're going to be.
Because I was starting to put some white in there. I noticed it was a bit nicer when I added some white, but I thought, I don't know, are we not meant to do that for the color wheel?
Oh yeah, you don't necessarily have to use the white, but if you want to get that vibrancy of that, making it a little bit lighter, you could add some white, but just try not to add some black, hopefully.
No black. Okay, got it.
Alrighty, so I'll start off with just a general composition of the sketch. of how to begin the still life itself. For the color wheel itself and then the achromatic grayscale, there is a separate video demonstrations under the modules tab, so make sure to review that. But all it is, guys, if you can have your lecture pulled up or the handout, and you could just use that image to just kind of follow along. Where do I put my red? Where do I put my yellow? And so on and so forth. Hopefully that helps. So another sort of key aspect to kind of keep in mind would be having another really good best friend, paper towels. Paper towels are going to be your best friend in this process. Now, let's talk a little bit about the brushes. Now, I do have a number 8 synthetic fan and then a number 6. Zoom in on this. Now you can start to see this is a Bristol brush, number 6 fan. The fan is obviously, angled as like an actual fan. This is a synthetic. It's almost more softer. You can also feel that it's more plasticky. This is a really great, helpful brush to use when you're using blending. Okay, depending if you're blending the fabrics, the surfaces, the textures, making different sort of surfaces on the painting, it's really helpful to have your fan brush. And this will be helpful when we get into the landscape painting next week as well. Now, again, 2 other brushes. I do have a number 6 round I'm going to be using. This is a number 6 round. It's a little dirty, which I need to clean off of, which is something we're going to talk a little bit more about when we talk about cleaning. Okay. I also have, a container. This is just a frosted glass container. I have some water in. It's a little dirty, which is okay. But I'm going to keep all my brushes in here on the side. So if I ever do need to go back and use it, it's ready to go. But I'm also going to take this container, and you could use any containers to your choosing. Okay. You don't necessarily have to use a lot, but this is going to be my diluted medium, which is my water. I'm going to keep my containers just separate so I don't cross contaminate each one. So hopefully they don't mix in with some of those colors. Guys, they're taking out the trash. Should I close my windows? Is it too loud?
You can't hear it. I don't think your microphone picks up background noise.
Oh, perfect. Well, then never mind.
I usually don't hear anything you're referencing in the background.
Okay, good. Okay. But then now we're going to get our glass palette. Just put these on the side. And let's talk a little bit those basic primers. Okay. Again, I'm just using the glass palette because it's a little bit easier for me to move around. Now let's talk a little bit about colors. Remove this in the opposite direction. Let's do this one. There you go. All right, is that clear? Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to start off with some of just my primaries. Okay, now you can follow along in this process if you would like. Again, so I have my blue, my cobalt blue. I have my alizarin crimson red. And I have my cadmium yellow. I'm almost out of my cadmium yellow. Okay. Now, just taking a standard, let's see whatever. Take my palette knife. Take just the paper towel. Now we're not blending anything together yet. All we are is just investigating those colors. Okay. How is the lighting, guys? Is it okay? It's good. So I'm going to take a little bit of my blue, and on my palette, I'm just going to move it over here, just right over here. Zoom in so we can get a good idea. There you go. The reason why I have my paper towel, and I can clean off my palette knife. Okay. And now I can take some red, I'm gonna have like ideally like 50-50, maybe 50% of red, 50% of blue. I'm just gonna mix it. And again, I'm picking it up and pushing it down on the surface of the glass palette. Picking it up, pushing it down, picking it up, pushing it down. And you could also spin in a counterclockwise or clockwise motion. And you're really just dragging your paint on the surface of the palettes, on the paper palette or on the glass palette, to really get a nice consistent color. Now, when I drag it, you'll start to see there's some red in there. And this is something I want you guys to sort of focus on. And when you see more red or more blue, just pick it up off your palette and blend it again, just to kind of mix it. And you should do this a few times in order just to sort of create a consistent violet, okay? Now, this goes back to Megan about your question about if the violet isn't too dark or isn't too light, if you add white, would it change? Let's actually do that right now. Let's see what happens when we add white, okay? Take my titanium white, you have your large tube. I'm just gonna add a little bit of white on the side. And this is changing the what? If we're adding white to a color. Anybody remember?
Saturation?
Is it tone?
Close.
Tint.
Is it tint, shade, or tone? Which one?
Tint.
There you go.
Tint.
So if you take some of that violet, I'm gonna pick it up on the palette here, and I have some white. I'm gonna mix it, and that white is not gonna be sucking all of that color. It's gonna sort of, again, just change the tint. So it's almost like a nice sort of lavender. You see that? Okay, and that really is interesting to sort of look at in the relationship of how much white you add. So let's say if I picked it up and I keep mixing, one thing to keep in mind is I don't want to cross-contaminate both colors. So I have to remember to keep enough distance on my palette. So because I like to work large scale, I'm working on a larger glass palette when I'm painting. But when you're working on a small scale, you could really take your time, blend some of your colors. And this is where I would say 50% of the job of our paintings is just by mixing color. Now I'm going to leave that flat right there. Now, if I have some left on my palette knife, take my paper towel and just clean it off. Take as much of it off because I don't want this to cross-contaminate when I add more yellow or add more red or add more blue, so on and so forth. Now I'm going to take some red and add it right over here. Okay. Clean my palette knife. I'm going to take some cadmium yellow and I'm going to go a little bit at a time because the cadmium's really strong. And add it to the red. You can see it's almost an orange red, right? Now I'm going to pick this up. I'm going to move it right over here. And actually, before even, I can also clean this off. You can also, let's say, for example, if you moved a actual paint from this mixture from here to here, take your paper towel, just blot it with a little bit of water, just a little bit, and just clean this off with some water, just a little bit, not too much. You don't want to have your palette wet, because if it is, your colors will start to move around on that surface, okay? I'm going to take a little bit of this, like maybe what, 30% of that as a ratio, clean this off, take more of that cadmium yellow, take more of it. I'm going to start to blend. And now I have a nice sort of orange, a really highly saturated orange. You guys see that?
Yeah.
Now let's talk a little bit about changing that color's intensity or the tint to white. So I'm going to actually mix this right next to, on the right-hand side of this color mixture, just keeping it right next to it. And you can see it almost seems like a coral. The more and more I'm going to add more orange, it almost seems like a salmon color, which is interesting. And I'm just keeping it right next to it so you can see those differences when I start adding more white. But then hypothetically, based off of the color wheel, if I have an orange, okay, and I'm going to take some of it up and put it right over here and have them clean off my palette. Again, if you're right-handed, you have your palette knife in your right hand and your paper towel in your left. And if you're left-handed, do a swap. Okay, this is a sort of a great, strategy to keep in mind when you're cleaning your palette. I see a lot of students always forget cleaning their palette and they cross-contaminate those primary colors when they have on the palettes. They're like, wait, what happened? It's because the palette wasn't clean. So keep that in mind. I'm just picking up a little bit of the cobalt blue and I'm actually going to mix it here with the orange. And that is a complementary color. Look what happens. You get this almost sort of green, almost turquoise, darker green. Do you see that? And that's interesting. Let's say, for example, if I'm happy with this color, and this is a color I'm going to use as a shadow, what happens if I lighten it with a little bit of white? I'm going to do it right next to it. And you'll start to see something interesting happen. It's a little bit hard to see in the camera. Some of that. You really get a light turquoise gray. So this is an interesting approach when you're creating a gray. Now that's something to really sort of keep in mind. This is a tone of a color. Okay, this is our tints of color. Because we're not using black, we're not going to be worrying too much about shades. But if we did, and let's say, for example, I want to add a shade of like a darker color, use more of the intensities of those primaries or your secondary colors that you've mixed with the color that you want to make a shade. So for example, if I take some yellow, put it over here. Let me zoom out slightly so we can see more of the palette. And again, guys, if we lose connection or if the internet drops, just let me know, because sometimes that does happen. I'm gonna take some cabinet yellow, so cobalt blue. I'm gonna make a what? A green. And this is what I want you guys to just sort of follow along throughout this process, but even before you start your color wheel. Get familiar with the colors, play around with it. Don't waste too much of your paints. A little bit goes a long time. Now, if I'm not happy with that green, I can change that intensity, okay, that saturation, or I can change the what? The shades, tints, and tones. But if I added more yellow, I'm going to make a tertiary color, which is a more yellow green, because I'm adding more of a primary color. I'm going just a little bit faster so you guys need to get an idea of what I'm talking about. And that is a green that I'm happy with. But then what's a complement of the green? Complementary color.
Red.
Exactly. So I'm going to take some alizarin crimson. And alizarin crimson is one of my favorite colors because it's fantastic for tonal variations of skin, flesh, fur, scales, anything of a live species. Now that red is intense. You can see it gets darker. It almost turns somewhat black. But the more and more color I add to it, the more and more darker it will become. And you almost get like sort of a muddy brown. All of that up, actually. And that's sort of a richer, browner, greener red. Now, if I change that intensity even further, and add more white so you can get an idea of how it looks in the palette. Now I'm already on my third paper towel, so we may go over a lot of paper towels this quarter, so buy a whole roll. You can see it's a dull, almost a dull pink. This is a great color when we're making any flesh tones, or if you're actually making any floral arrangements of flowers, as well as live animals, okay? This is a wonderful color to use. It's almost a duller, almost grayer pink. It's not too peachy or too pink or vibrant, so it's not fully saturated, which is something that you want to keep in mind. So that's a really interesting color here. This is what I want you guys just to play around with today and see what's comfortable, what you feel comfortable with. Now, the next level of the sort of process of when we're working with that primaries and kind of mixing in to make a secondary or tertiary color would be to sort of look at some of those color variations on the supply list, and we'll start to think about what to use when we're blending those colors from our base colors, which are these three here. Okay, so I have yellow ochre, raw umber, burnt umber. These three colors are fantastic base colors to use, specifically these two, okay? The raw umber and burnt umber. So throughout the process, when we sketch out a drawing on our first layer of our paintings, these are colors that you should be using. These are fantastic dead layers, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get into the actual demo. We're going to be making with our actual paintings. And in terms of the sort of early old masters, kind of early Renaissance to Northern Baroque, these are the colors used by the old masters to create their actual paintings. But we'll apply that onto the actual painting itself. I'm going to use.
Can I ask a quick question before you go on?
Go ahead.
When you're talking about burnt umber, do you mean burnt sienna? I didn't see a burnt umber on the supply list.
Oh, wait, hold on. I have a yellow ochre. I think I might have actually got the wrong color. It should be you have burnt sienna?
I have yellow ochre, raw umber, and then burnt sienna.
It is burnt sienna, excuse me. I actually got the wrong color. It's burnt umber. We're going to use raw umber. We have raw umber, everybody?
Mhm.
Thank you for that, for clarifying. I need to get that color today. Okay, let's use some raw umber. So how do we start? Okay, I have my container of my brushes here. I have just two brushes in here. Put that on the side. Okay, I have my canvas ready to go. Okay, I have my palette right next to me. Now, I can also, I don't want to waste any of this, but you can also, for the sake of the demo, it's okay. I'm going to actually clear all of this off with some paper towels. Okay, so pick it all up before it dries. And even if it dries, you could just take your palette knife, take as much of it off, and you don't want to waste too much paints, but it's okay. Because again, we're just practicing for today. I'm going to leave some of the white on there.
While you're doing that, can I ask one more quick question?
Yes.
So I got canvas panels. Is that okay for like the 18 by 24?
Ideally, no. We have to use stretched canvas. Panels is wood, so that's going to be a different surface.
Okay.
Again, guys, state your name when you're speaking, so I can remember who's speaking.
Oh, I'm Diana.
Diana?
Mhm.
Okay. Try, if you can, Diana, try to get the stretched canvas. The panels are a great, they're great for painting, but just for the sake of this class, we have to work with our stretched canvas.
Okay.
I don't think you list stretch canvas on the supplies list. You have cotton canvas and
Yeah, that's what that is.
canvas pad. Oh, the cotton canvas is stretching. Okay.
Yes, correct. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
I apologize if I wasn't clear.
I'm sorry, I don't know the difference. So,
So a stretched canvas is this guy here. It's already stretched onto the stretchers. That's also, cotton canvas. It's also what it's called, but it's really, there is an image on there with the label of the traditional profile in orange. So it should be on there as an example. And the direct link should pull up. when we're talking about the canvas, it's the larger painting that we're going to be working on. Okay, does that make sense? And Jessica?
I had a question. Sometimes I see those material without the wood frame.
Yeah.
It's flat. What are those? What do we use those for? And what's the difference?
Without the wood frame, you said?
Yeah,
So
it's just flat. It's just flat, but it's hard surface.
so those are probably, are they canvas pads? Were they the canvas pads or no?
I think they're the same material, but
Yes.
it's
So there are the canvas pads here that's available. These, are required for the class itself. But remember, when you go to the Blick store, there are hundreds of options. There's panels, there's linen, there's cotton, there's primed canvas, there's primed canvas, there's pre-stretched, unstretched. There's so many variables. You may sometimes get inundated with too many options. So a good idea and a reference to always go back to would be that supply list, because it narrows down the search of what we need. We don't have the time to review all of those surfaces, and especially in terms of how to stretch a canvas, how to prime a canvas, what happens if you use an oil ground or a matte medium ground. Those are different techniques and strategies that you can use, but because of the summer schedule, we just don't have the time. So this is, again, the very basic of basic. Does that make sense?
okay. Yeah.
All right, any other questions before we start? Okay, I have my raw umber, and I'm actually going to put a little bit of cobalt blue on the side. And again, my veterans who've taken my drawing class, you know what happens when you add blue to brown. You make a what? A black. So let's talk a little bit about this. Now, again, I have my photographic reference projected on my screen. Okay, I'm going to just take a brush. Okay, there's some water in there, so that's also something I want to keep in mind. It's a little dirty, which is okay. In order to clean your brushes, guys, you could just use some dish soap. Actually, that brush is still a little too dirty. I'm going to switch over to a number 6 round, another number 6.
I have a question about the color wheel.
Yes.
What's the best way to separate or to pre-section off the areas of where the colors need to be on the outer circle? What's the best way to measure that out?
I would say maybe it's probably like 2 inches wide, maybe section them off with some tape.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Of course. Now, let's talk a little bit about these colors. Now, I'm just blotting my palette with a little bit of the water and the brush itself. I'm using a number 6 brown synthetic. I'm going to take some raw umber and just kind of move it here. And it gets really thin because there's water on there. Again, water is my primary medium. Okay. Now I can do a cross contamination with the brush, but I'm just gonna take my palette knife and actually, let me get some more paper towels. Okay. Just clear this up. Make sure that's clean, ready to go. Okay. Now, because these are all water-based, I'm going to take a little bit of the blue, just a little bit, not too much, and pour it on there. Pick up some more brown or raw umber, excuse me, and mix it. This is a great color to mix once you're mixing a black. Now, going back to those tint shades and tones, this is a great tone of black. And then when you dilute this with water, you'll see how rich and dark that is. But then again, the more layers we add, the richer and the highly saturated colors will be. Now, okay, I'm going to put the palette on the side. Now let's go to the canvas. Now again, I'm using the reference available on the modules tab, which is also available on the chat. I'm going to zoom out of my camera. Okay, so I have, again, a clear idea of my picture plane. Okay, my length times width. I have my center. This is what I'm going to be using to make the preliminary drawing. So Again, I have my paintbrush loaded up with my raw umber as well as my cobalt blue mixture. Now I don't want too much on there. So if I take my paper towel, I'm just gonna drag it on there. That's all that excess paint. That's a lot, okay? And I'm gonna dilute it just a little bit more with water because I want almost sort of a watercolor consistency. Want it nice and thin. And this is where we start the drawing process. We do not draw with graphite, we draw with a brush, okay? In order to sort of, again, get familiar with this process, you have to start using a brush instead of a pencil, okay? Now, you can start off anywhere throughout this process. I'm gonna start off right over here with actually in this sort of picture plane. So I'm gonna just kind of like gradually make an outline of my oranges. And I'm just holding the tip of the brush. I'm not worrying about any details. I'm not worrying about any shadows and any darks. This is what happens when you're drawing the painting. Okay, that's that orange there. This is this orange here. This is, again, just following along to that side. I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger. Have my oranges there. I'm going to dilute that a little bit more on my palette, mixing in with a little bit more water of that brown, okay? There's that sort of almost marble tray, which is right around here. And I have a saucer, okay, which is right around here. That's sort of above, sort of almost eye level line. I'm going to go over and around. Okay, that's the saucer of that container. I have the large obulus, which is almost, again, a sort of geometric shape. Those of you taking my art appreciation class, you know what an obulus is. Okay. Let's say if you ever make any marks that you weren't happy with, you can always then go back and actually pick it all up and just blend that away. And it blends into the surface, which is completely okay. But then if you add water, just raw water with your brush, and then take your paper towel while it's still wet. This is how you can erase. Okay. Any questions about that? You can see all of that came off. You get some more paper towels. Okay. And you want to wait for that area to dry, but you don't necessarily have to, because you could just add more paint directly onto there. Let's say, for example, if the obelisk needs to be adjusted. Right there. That's the sort of side. Okay. I'm going to just block that in. I'm just blocking in some of these colors, guys. I'm like, okay, so the obelisk will be there. Not worrying about any details, not worrying about any of that, because that is not important. What's important is to sort of figure out the composition. Okay, silver ewer, and that's probably around the top, which is right around here. This is the top of that ewer. That's right around here. I have some of the eucalyptus leaves. You could use the flat edge, you could use the tip. I'm just drawing some of that in there. Guys, my light is changing because the sun is going down. Let me know if it gets too dark. I can turn on some of the lights. Okay.
For the color wheel, are the three primaries the cobalt blue, the cad yellow, and the Alzarian crimson hue?
Correct.
Cool. Thank you.
Of course. Again, I'm just making it very generalized, just to kind of, again, get my composition first. See that amethyst stone, which is probably around here. And it's really interesting texture, so I'm just gonna just blot in some of these marks to sort of indicate that's where that crystallized amethyst stone center is. And also just harden some of those edges because I want those areas to be slightly sharper. And then you can start to see the background here of where that shadow is. I'm just gonna darken that a little bit so it separates it. That's where the stool of the other candle is, but it got cut off in the picture plane. So we're gonna leave that until and then move on to the plant on the left-hand side, which is here. Now you can start to see. Again, guys, is that loud outside? Just want to make sure you guys can hear me. You can start to see, again, holding it very, very loosely. There's those vertical lines that run through the plant. And this is a sort of a wet, excuse me, a dry approach instead of an alla prima wet on wet, because you don't want it to be too wet, because you want to start to, again, figure out the composition first. Okay, that's one side of those side of the plant. I'm just moving this brush back and forth. It's another side of that plant. I'm going to dilute it more because you could feel a resistance on the surface. So for example, I can hear it too, which is interesting. Again, guys, feel free to ask questions and interrupt me anytime. So let me know if you have questions at this process. Okay. But then also, I can then now add that the sides of the citrus coming off to that side, and then there's shadows here. But I'm just going to indicate this where the this is where I'm going to blend further along on the drawing. And then before I get into the second composition, I can then add more darks or whites. At the base of the ewer, like right around here. But there's really interesting, you know, that's where the plant comes off on that side. And this, again, guys, this is, for these early stages are crucial because I want to figure out how the composition looks and if I'm happy with it. Okay. So this is, again, the drawing aspect of the painting. Okay. Didn't take that long, just a few minutes. But this is how we draw our first layers of our paintings. Remember, this is just one way. You don't necessarily have to do this way. You have to then experiment and see what's working. It's not.
This is Carla. Can I ask a question?
Of course. Go ahead,
So
Carla.
what do you think so about the drawing? You emphasize learning to draw with the paintbrush,
Yes.
right? And is that equal to learning to draw within the grids or with the help of the grids?
Yes. I mean, I drew the grid with some graphite just to sort of get those nice and sharp lines so I can make sure those are sharp. But if if you're thinking about drawing your first layer with graphite, you're not really, I mean, not necessarily you, Clara, or Carla, excuse me. You're not necessarily painting. And this is the difference between with the painting aspect, because you must get familiar with the brush, almost as a drawing tool. Then it forces your hand to only work with the brush instead of just following along each line of the graphite. Now, mind you, Carla,
Thank you.
I mean, of
Oh,
course, I was just gonna say,
no, this is
go ahead.
just, this is kind of, this is something new to me, or maybe it's the first time I'm grasping
Yeah.
to paint, to draw with the brush.
Yeah. This is
So
how-
thank you.
Of course, this is how I was taught when I went to grad school and when I did my undergrad. Again, guys, this is one method of doing it. You don't necessarily, it may not work for everybody. And this is the point that I want you guys to start to understand is there are so many different ways of painting. This is just one. Now, Carla, you may encounter another method. You may, let's say, for example, if this strategy of creating your preliminary drawing with the brush isn't working, I can't stop you guys. This is just one method that I feel like it's helped me progress my painting process. So that's something to consider. Not necessarily one is better than the other because it all depends, right? I hope that helps.
Was very helpful. Thank you.
My pleasure. You could also take your paper towel and also kind of like blend in some of those areas and take off some of those oils, excuse me, those acrylics. Oils, that's funny. Now I can see with the reflection of the silver ewer of this picture, I'm just gonna draw in some of those lines, but I see the reflection of the bottle, excuse me, of the saucer, which is right here. I'm just darkening it a little bit more so I can see some clarity. I know the image itself is white, like the saucer itself, it's pure white. It's a porcelain. So I need to keep this in mind. But what this helps me is then understanding the foundation of how light is reflected onto surfaces. So if this is a more opaque material, I will then move over here, which is much more reflective, which is also opaque, is reflecting the object on its surface. And by color mixing, I will then be able to then start to see what colors to use, okay? What questions do we have about this so far? About the drawing aspect in the beginning of our paintings?
This is Rachel.
Go ahead, Rachel.
I was wondering when you said you're starting to like block in colors, what exactly does that mean and like how does it help?
Yeah, definitely. So the beginning of in any painting, you're really just trying to map out the composition. It's pretty much the same thing as blocking. So you're making these geometric forms, you're making all of these geometric abstract marks, painting marks, to then simplify those objects. And then you can start to see how they relate in relationship to each other. That plant is all the way back there. The obelisk is sort of in the center. Adjacent to that is the silver ewer with all of the eucalyptus that's coming out, so on and forth. And then you can start to see by just making an abstract shape like this of the saucer, of the orange, of the obelisk, of this marble tray, of the amethyst stone. I'm just mapping them out and I'm blocking in each shade, each shape of the color. Now, color blocking is where it gets interesting. Let's say, for example, let's go to the orange. So I'm gonna add, now let's make an orange, okay? Here's my colors. So I'm gonna take some alizarin crimson. Where is it? Alizarin crimson. And I'm gonna take some yellow. And I'm gonna blend that in there. But instead of just blending it directly, I'm gonna, take some cadmium yellow. And again, a little bit goes a long time, guys. You don't want to waste too much of your paints. Don't do what I did and actually waste all my paint and throw it away. But there's nothing wrong with it. This is, again, guys, this is a learning process. So take your time. Take some cadmium yellow, mix it in some red, some alizarin crimson.
How long does it take for canvas to dry?
With the acrylics, probably just a few minutes, to be honest, maybe 15, 20 minutes, depending on how thick your painting is or how much water you have on there. You could also take a blow dryer or just leave it in front of a fan and it should dry pretty quickly. That makes sense, Dio?
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
And then what's the matte medium for? I have this from my previous class and I remember using it, but I think that might have been why I struggled with acrylics the first time I did it.
We're not using any matte mediums. We're only using water as a medium though.
Yes, I was just curious
Oh.
if you what is it used for? What's the benefit? Because before I thought it was just to make it so the paint could go longer or like
You could
more paint.
exactly. You can change the thickness and the thinness of the paint, and you can change the drying time depending on the matte medium that you got. You could also use it as a ground. You could add a layer of matte medium to soften the surface of the fiber of the canvas, or you could blend it with your actual acrylic paints.
Oh,
Again,
so you get less tooth.
correct, exactly. It
Oh,
almost
cool.
becomes like a watercolor.
Mhm.
If that helps, I can show you how to do that after class. But again, guys, what Dio's talking about, you do not have to get, so keep in mind. Okay, so I'm just making an orange. Rachel, this goes back to your question about color blocking. This is what I'm talking about. So now I have a composition of those oranges, right? Which is right around here. What I'm gonna do is just apply a layer, a thin layer of just color blocking the orange. That's it. Just color blocking it, because then it'll help me understand what colors to use. Notice you can see the transparency, what was underneath that, because there's a lot of water that was mixed to that, okay? And the reason why is because I don't want it too thick when I apply more layers. So now, for example, I'm using the entire surface of my number 6 round synthetic brush and just kind of not blending, just blocking it in, because I'm not worrying about any values now. I'm just worrying about the form of those oranges.
Okay, cool. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And you want to, like, for especially early on, you want to dilute the paints a lot so it's thinner.
And the reason why you want to make them this thin is because it's easier to see what was underneath. And let's say, okay, I'm going to add a dramatic red on top of it. Look what happens without any water. I'm going to add a red as a shadow right here. You can barely see what was underneath. It's so intense. This is where things become highly saturated, right? And if I left that red to dry, it may dry a little darker. But then if I take my brush quickly, and this all depends on timing, if I just blot it with some paper towel and kind of made it wet, I can blend this into that orange. And look what happens. It's more transparent. But then let's say I'm going to dilute it even more. And you could also pick it up. You could also pick up some of that excess red, but you can see what happens in terms of that intensity. If I add it here, or you could take your paper towel and actually just blot it. Just be careful, don't apply too much pressure. While it's still wet, you see that? I could just blend that in there. I can blot it a little bit more. I can blend that in there. And now you can start to see color variations of dark shadows to those lights. And this is where we get into the form of each individual object. Did that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Of course. Any other questions, guys? Okay. Now, let's talk about surface quality. Okay. Now, when I have my drawing good to go and I'm happy with it, I'm going to go back. And now let's say, for example, let's work on the obulus, for example, in relationship to the rest of the objects. Now you're blocking in some of those colors. The obulus itself, based on the image that you guys can see, this side is cooler. This side is warmer. I actually need to change this line because it's a little bit more to the right, excuse me, to the left. But what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take some raw umber, some cobalt blue, I'm gonna mix that on my palette. I'm going to add a little bit of white. Remember, because these are acrylic, guys, you don't want to add too much because they may dry. And I almost have a sort of gray sort of color. I'm going to then just sort of color block this side. And I'm just changing that line because I wasn't happy with it. I'm color blocking this side, meaning I'm just filling it in with just one color. And this is still pretty thick, but I can dilute it with some water. And you can feel the surface quality change. There's less of a resistance. Okay. see the pointed top, where the pyramids are. Okay. Just color blocking there. And I'm going to do the same thing with the other side, but I'm actually going to add a little bit of the red, yellow, orange color that we made to separate each color. And notice, look what happens. It gets really dark. And this is completely okay. Because again, you're just color blocking these shapes. And I'm sorry, guys, sometimes I hit my camera on my with my brush. I apologize in advance. Now, notice I'm going up and down vertically. If I go left to right horizontally, you could feel a different resistance of those colors. I'm not worrying about what? Key thing, detail, okay? You could also blot and start removing some of that. But look, it's warmer now in terms of those intensities. Do the same thing here. Remove those. Okay, you can see there's more surface quality to that, okay? Now, depending on how dark or how light, you have to then examine the photographic reference and start to see where those shadows are in relationship to the painting. I'm going to start adding some shadows. So I notice, depending what's around the actual object itself, there's a variety of value, sort of almost everywhere. So I'm going to add some value here. And these are the sort of the shadows that almost frame the shape of the object. Now, because these are geometric shapes, you want to keep them nice and sort of sharp on that edge. And I'm making it a lot thinner. You can start to see. And this is where the form almost changes too, which is another thing you need to keep in mind. And then I can then start to then play around with changing that intensity more and more. There's more shadows here. And you will, this is again, all layering process because you're just blocking in some of those shadows to separate tone, to separate shade, value, intensity of color, chroma.
Are we using water on our brush when we're doing the color wheel?
You can if you want to dilute it, just a little bit, just very little, probably like 10% to be honest.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, good question. Any other questions, guys? Feel free to ask. I'm getting really, really dark, which is great. Because look what happens now, the obelisk comes forward. Just making sure that geometric shape is correct. And this is where things get tricky. I'm not using any water. This is all paint. Just mixing it onto the palette. This is that cobalt blue and umber, raw umber. Which is a great color. You see that? Now you can start shaping. And this is where we, again, fix the drawing. We're fixing the composition. We're aligning it to form the correct geometric shape of the object. And let's say, for example, if I diluted this area, I'm taking my brush, I just dipped it with some water, I'm just going to add it and start to mix it to this area, but it will be transparent, which is okay. But then I know because my towels are blue, there's a cooler tint to that, which is completely okay. Now, if it's a warmer sheet or drapery in the background, I have to keep in mind, so I should add a warmer color. You can see all those paint marks much more clearly in relationship to something that's more saturated with color. Let's say, for example, if I removed it, the paper towel can be a fun texture. you can start dabbing and have fun with it. I like to sometimes use my fingers to kind of move, and you can start to feel the paint and say, okay, there's a little bit too much, there's a little bit too less. I can pick it up with my hand. This is all water-based, guys, so it's not dangerous, so don't worry about that.
And the canvas holds up much better than paper, where paper would pill kind of over time. This doesn't have that issue.
Exactly. It does not.
Is there anything to watch out for the material?
Honestly, for it to spill over your counter. So if you have some, I like to use some drawing, like used old drawing paper or just a canvas pad. I have a large one, like those painting ones that you could get from Home Depot. You could use newspapers, you could use anything, a plastic sheet underneath your counter so you don't make your counters dirty. That's another thing. Again, guys, painting is a really dirty process, but it's actually really fun and liberating the more you get into the method of painting, because you really get lost in the world of painting, which is really fun. But in terms of practicality, just don't wear your nice clothes. Wear simple clothes, that you'll know you might get potentially dirty, which is okay. But if you don't want to get your nice clothes dirty, that's completely okay. Just be mindful.
And if you're not using any water and you're using a different acrylic color, and you put another paint on top of another color, does it typically completely cover the color below it?
Depending on how
Or
much
does it blend in if it's dried, if the previous color is dry?
if it's dry, let's say if this area was dry and added red on top of it or yellow,
Mhm.
if I dilute it with water, it would be transparent. But if I
Okay.
get really, really thick and add very little water, it will be hard to see the color underneath, which is this dark brown blue. Did that make
Cool.
sense?
Just more curious because the center of the color wheel, I was debating whether or not to use extra tape to separate the primary colors. Or start with one and then just layer the other to make it a crisp line with the second color and then third.
Yeah. Now, again, part of this process, I'm not interested in the measurements being correct or like if they overlap. If they kind of slightly overlap, that's okay. You can use some tape to kind of separate them. Just wait from one area to the next for it to dry. But I'm more interested into sort of thinking about how well students are able to kind of mix in those colors, specifically secondary and tertiary colors, on that color wheel, just to kind of, again, wrap your minds around how we use these colors to kind of give the differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary. I hope that helps. Does that help?
Yeah, I was just more technique. I just remember I've used transparent primary tones, so I've never used ones that are more opaque.
Yeah. The more opaque, I think, depending on the image or depending on the reference that we use, may actually work better, depending on what you want from the actual painting. But we'll get into that, especially when we get into landscape paintings the following week. Not next week, but then the week after.
Yeah, if I recall, I remember if thinking back on Bob Ross, he would do like a black that he used, and then he would use a transparent red, yellow, blue, and then he would put like, I think it was titanium white if he was doing like Northern Lights, and he would do that over, and then as he dragged it across the black, a little bit of the transparent colors on top of the black would blend into the white.
Yeah. He was such a great guy, Bob Ross.
I grew up watching him with my grandmother, so.
He was fantastic. I think his son is now painting, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, his son did a couple episodes. I don't think his son ended up getting the good deal though, out of like maintaining the brand.
Yeah. Just going over this area here. Now you can see I'm adding more thicker layers to give that sort of sense of how the obelisk is going to be more opaque because it's made out of a marble. Just being really cautious. I don't want to blend this color to that color, but you can kind of see, because it's a geometric shape, I want to make it as straight as possible, but there's textures around there. And I'm going to take a smaller brush and add more detail on top of that once I get a more comfortable second layer of color on top of that. Any other questions, guys? This is now a good opportunity if you have any questions or concerns about your assignment.
Yeah, this is Jessica.
ahead.
I have questions like when you had you had your picture and you draw a group on the picture, and then is that mean we have to set up
Yep,
and then we take the pictures?
correct. So you're gonna set up your still life,
Oh, okay.
document that, then you'll upload that onto the assignments tab as well with your completed painting. Okay, and then remember, guys, there's the tips and guidelines video and instructions of how to upload and document your photos and your paintings under the modules tab. But if you do need more assistance, just let me know, and then we can figure out what we can do about navigating that.
Documents.
Yes.
What you?
Just to photograph your image. That's what.
Okay. Photograph, not like. Okay, thank you.
Of course, my pleasure. Again, guys, yeah, keep asking questions, guys. There's no such thing as a wrong question. Okay, I want you guys to start asking more questions. To me, that tells me that you're paying attention, but also aware of any difficulties. If you can ask me, and you're at least comfortable to ask me. Okay, so I'm going to work on this a little bit further. Okay, more and more. I'm going to finish hopefully the painting with the first. This is still working on the second layer, but this is ideally still the first layer. When we're color blocking, and now working on more towards that third layer, you can start to see that intensity of semi-transparent, completely opaque colors, okay, by darkening around that obulus and then so on and so forth. I'm going to work on the ewer, the silver ewer, the eucalyptus, and then the black pot in the back with the saucer, the marble tray, and the amethyst stone. What questions do we have about this assignment?
Is this the under? Oh,
Oh, yeah, this is Megan talking. I have just a quick question. So
Yeah.
the last time I took any sort of painting class was probably around 30 years ago. So I had learned then that we should kind of create a background first. And I'm just wondering.
I mean, Megan, you can, and I actually have that required for my drawing class, but depending on your setup of your still life, you don't necessarily have to.
Okay.
It's up to you. It's a great foundation because then it fills in all that negative space around the edges. But if you're not happy with your background, you can keep it a solid color.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
This is Jessica again. So you have us to buy 3 those 18 by 24 canvas. So
Sure.
does that mean during the whole quarter we only did 3 big painting?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure. And then Dio, you're going to ask me something?
I forgot. Sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. Any other questions, guys?
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask. So is this the underpainting? Because there'll be lots of layers moving forward to really get all the details.
Yes,
I kind of go in with the details, so I'm trying to figure out how I should approach this. This is kind of like water painting where we do the first under layer and then you just kind of build forward.
Correct. So a good rule of thumb, thank you for that question, by the way, is to work really from the first layer, drawing out the composition, figuring out where the arrangements of the objects are to the painting. Your actual colors that you should start off is darks to light. So for the final layers that I add, I'm going to add probably like around 4 to 5 layers of color. I'll then figure out where the light source is and either change that intensity, whether if it's the colors here, which is going to be more warmer, or whether if it's the colors here on the right are going to be a little bit more cooler. And that's depending on the image, right? Now, like for example, if you had a color, a light source that is more neutral throughout the entire painting, you can also just keep that in mind because you don't have to change that intensity of colors. That is a warmer color, which is going to be red or yellow ochre, or even cadmium yellow, or if it's a cooler color, more cobalt blue with a little bit of brown, depending on the intensity, you could just keep it all neutral. Again, guys, that's the one way of doing it from the reference that I have available on the modules tab. I'm going to continue working on this. And later throughout the painting, if I stop and if I start to encounter more issues, I'll be able to list the details of what you can do to fix it exactly. Now, if you have references that you're thinking about, and you have a sort of a general idea of what you want your composition to look like, now is a good time if you want to send that to me. We can do a screen share to see what it looks like. And also talk a little bit about like, how do you start and how do you frame your picture plane? Let me just, actually, I'm going to wash my hands real fast. Give me 2 seconds. Okay, so I'm going to leave this be. I'm going to wait for this area to dry a little bit, take about a few minutes. I'm going to move over to camera number